Welcome to the Megillah Project.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us. We want to talk a little bit about how the story of Esther is used in unexpected ways in the Talmud, even in the most important of ways, because ultimately this particular text that we're going to look at in the Talmud from the tractate called Shabbat, page 88a, actually makes the Torah itself binding, or does it, on the Jewish people based on a quote from the book of Esther. So arguably the book of Esther, in the eyes of the Talmud, is the most important book of all.
But you're giving the punchline away.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what you said is really important. The stories in the Hebrew Bible are interesting all by themselves. But what's more interesting is the way the tradition uses those stories and what they do with them. I think that's what's most important.
So let's start looking at this text. We're going to go pretty quickly through the main idea of the beginning of the text, because mostly what we're focusing on here in this discussion is the use of the book of Esther. But let's just jump into the basic premise of the text, because we have to understand that in order to understand how the book of Esther is used. So again, the text is tractate Shabbat, page 88a, and it starts like this. It's showing us the scene of the Israelites standing at Mount Sinai receiving the Torah. And it's quoting from the book of Exodus, where the Torah says, "And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the lowermost part of the mountain," or at the foot of the mountain. And what's going to happen here is that the rabbis of the Talmud are really going to make some meaning out of this word tachat, which is usually translated as the foot of the mountain, and they're going to read it in a different way.
Right. And if anyone knows Yiddish, they know that the Yiddish pronunciation or the Yiddish form of this word tachat is, of course, tuches, which means your underside, right? So literally, the text is saying that they stood at the or in the underside of the mountain. And the rabbis are going to make a lot of sausage out of that underside word. But I just want to point out that standing at the underside of the mountain is really no richer in inherent meaning than saying they stood at the foot of the mountain. In other words, nobody would imagine the foot actually being a foot, or imagining that a foot is stepping on you, or everyone accepts immediately that it's a term of art, foot of the mountain, and it doesn't have anything to do with foot. And the rabbis are taking this standing at the underside of the mountain as not a term of art, but actually pregnant with meaning. Okay.
Yeah, although it's actually interesting because I hadn't really thought about it before, that if we translated this just as they stood at the foot of the mountain, then we could basically make the same point that we're about to read without having to get to some of what we're about to see. And it's really interesting just to think about those metaphors like the foot or the butt, etc. But let's look. So Rabbi Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa interprets this, and he says that the Jewish people actually stood under the mountain, beneath the mountain. And what the verse is teaching us here is that the Holy Blessed One overturned the mountain above the Jews like a tub and said to them, "If you accept the Torah, great. And if not, here will be your burial." Meaning that God is telling the people of Israel that he is actually going to drop the mountain on top of them unless they accept the Torah. And in any legal system, in contract law, there is a concept of a contract made under duress, where one of the parties doesn't actually have the freedom to decide whether or not to actually enter into this contract. And in every legal system, a contract made under duress is not binding. And the argument that Rav Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa is giving us here is that therefore the Torah is not binding because it was a contract made under duress.
And in fact, the Gemara is going to make that point explicitly in our system too. Any contract made under duress is not binding. And I think what's fascinating about this text is that no voice jumps in to say, what? oh my God, all these years, all these, let's see, by the time we get to them, it's 1,800 years or so. For the last 1,800 years, the Torah hasn't been binding. The Torah is not binding on us. There's no obligation to follow the mitzvot. What? My mind is blown. Nobody says that. It's, oh yeah, right. It's not binding. It's never been binding.
Right. And so then let's look at what flows from that idea. So Rav Acha Bar Yaakov says, from here, there is a substantial caveat to the obligation to fulfill the Torah, or otherwise translated as, from here, there's a substantial protest to the Torah, meaning that what he's saying is that just like you said, in the Jewish legal system, just like in other legal systems, a contract made under duress is not binding. And if the Torah was actually given under these circumstances where the mountain was being held on top of people's heads, then the Torah would not be binding. And I think that the reason why nobody is protesting against this view is because just like saying the foot of the mountain, that's a metaphor, but we understand what it means, that here too, this vision of the mountain actually being pulled out of the ground and held on top of the Jews is a colorful way of showing what the Torah already shows us in its own language, that there was thunder and there was lightning and the Israelites were scared and they didn't want to have God keep talking and they wanted Moses to say the Ten Commandments instead of God because it was so scary. That obviously is exactly the same thing, that you have a very powerful God and a very powerless people. And you can't really look at a situation like that and say this is two equal parties making a contract. And many legal systems, including the Jewish one, say if the two parties have vastly unequal power, then we at least have to look very carefully at that contract with the suspicion that it might have been made under duress. And so this is just a colorful way of showing us what the Torah already shows us. And I think that people look at that and they say, yeah, you know, that's actually a really significant idea.
Although I'm not sure if Amcha, the everyday person, is reading the thunder and the smoke in the Torah and going, hey, wait a minute, I'm not obligated. This feels to me like a very insider conversation, which for my money is a way for the rabbis to kind of make the case amongst themselves that there actually is, or if they'll need to give it to those outside, there actually is justification for all the fast and loose we're playing with this tradition, because they need the looseness, they need the ability to do that in an authentic way for their authority to be recognized. So they're disconnecting that obligation as the ground on which they can now play.
So at least in the elite circles of the rabbis, if not more broadly than that, there seems to be a broad agreement, because nobody is arguing here. There seems to be a broad agreement that the Torah, at least for the last, for some bunch of years, and between the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai and the story of Esther, which we're about to look at, the Torah was not binding and may, as we'll see later, may still not be binding. But there's this broad agreement. And that obviously gives us some authority as rabbis back then. And maybe it also is a little bit nervous-making. And so what we see here is the book of Esther being brought in by Rava, who is one of the greatest rabbis of the Talmud, if not the greatest. His name means the rabbi. It's not his name, it's his title, the rabbi. He says by implication that the Torah, yeah, you're right, it wasn't binding back then. But even so, they, meaning the Jews, again accepted it willingly in the time of Achashverosh, i.e. in the time of the Purim story. As it is written in the book of Esther, the Jews ordained and took upon themselves and upon their seed and upon all such others as joined unto them, in Esther chapter 9, verse 27. And he interprets that to mean that the Jews ordained what they had already taken upon themselves, meaning that what was coerced upon them at Sinai, they then later ratified. And that's also a concept in contract law more generally, and in all forms of contract law that I know about, that it could be that there's a contract that wasn't binding when it was made, but if you come later and you say, well, now I actually do have the power to decide whether or not to enter into this contract, and so I'm going to ratify it, I'm going to say, I now consider myself bound by this contract, that's a thing that you can do. And so Rava here is basically saying that that's what happened, that the Jews ratified the Torah 1,000+ years later, even though it wasn't binding before, now it's binding after the Purim story because they ratified it.
Right. So Rava's jumping on the words ordained and ratified. And Rav is saying the antecedent of it, they ordained and ratified it, is Torah. When actually in the context of that verse, which we should look at now, the antecedent was something very, very, very different in the Pshat. So we see that the Rava playing fast and loose with the story of Esther to justify now the bindingness of Torah. And let's just look at the role of this, the Esther story generally in the rabbi's eyes, okay? You know, while we don't typically teach this in Hebrew school, I think it was pretty well understood that the story of Esther is it's a cartoon. And the rabbis knew it was a cartoon. It's a made-up story. So for them, for Rava to invoke a verse in Esther is like invoking the Flintstones and saying, oh, the Torah wasn't binding at Sinai because the Torah was given under duress, but now it is binding because in the Flintstones, we accepted it. And so there's an extra wink because of how the rabbis have to know everyone around the table is going to understand Esther as a cartoon. So how actually in force is the obligation of Torah if it was actually enforced in the Flintstones?
Right. And not only is it a situation where they're quoting a comedy, quoting a farce, quoting a clear myth, a story that didn't really happen, that didn't really think happened, but they're misquoting it.
Right.
So if we look at the book of Esther, we find that here's the context of that quote. It's from Esther chapter 9, verse 27. So let's look on either side of it. Esther chapter 9, verses 26 to 28. So it starts like this. For that reason, this is a letter. There was a letter talking about everything that happened on Purim, this great miracle. For that reason, these days were named Purim after Pur, which means a lottery, because the day of the intended destruction of the Jews was pulled out of a hat, was a lottery. In view then of all the instructions in the letter of what they had experienced in that matter and what had befallen them, the Jews ordained and took upon themselves, here's the language, and their descendants and all who might join them, to observe these 2 days in the manner prescribed and at the proper time each year. Consequently, these days are recalled and observed in every generation by every family, every province, and every city. And these days of Purim shall never cease among the Jews, and the memory of them shall never perish among their descendants. So quite clearly, in its context, this quote that the Jews ordained and took upon themselves something is not that they ordained and took upon themselves, they ordained and ratified the Torah. In Hebrew, by the way, that's kiyamu v'kiblu. They didn't take upon themselves and ratify the Torah, they took upon themselves and ratified the holiday of Purim. And so it is a misquotation from the Flintstones being used to prove the most important thing that Judaism has to prove, which is that the Torah is binding upon the Jews.
Right, which leaves us, if you really understand the farce of the argument that it really is binding, it leaves us with what they're actually trying to say, which is, guess what? It actually still isn't. We can actually still play fast and loose. That's what we always were meant to do. In their minds, that's what we not only can still do, but we have to do. So I think you're right that they were uncomfortable with being a completely open system without some kind of obligation. And so they want to reassert an obligation. They want to have their cake and eat it too. But at the end of the day, really the only cake they have is we can always play fast and loose. And that's what God wants of us.
Yeah, and lest you think that this is some kind of newfangled interpretation by some radical 21st century Jews, it may or may not be that, but it's quite hard to imagine that this isn't exactly the way that any of the people in the game back then would have read it. Because what we have to understand is that not too many people were capable of reading the Talmud back then. And anybody who was capable of reading the Talmud back then was also capable of reading the rest of the Bible. And not only were they capable of it, they did. And so anybody who read this would know that that quote is taken out of context and doesn't have anything to do with the Torah in the book of Esther, and would know that the book of Esther is one of those books that we consider to be kind of a farce, kind of something that is other than what it appears in all kinds of ways, and that you could make a pretty roundabout spiritual argument in some way that says that it's because the book of Esther isn't what it appears, that actually everything in it means something other and more spiritual and deeper than what it appears to mean. You could make that argument, but our sense is that most people were not making that argument back then. They understood exactly what was going on here. And it was exactly for the purpose that you're talking about, that in their world of the elite rabbis who were reimagining Judaism at this new stage, they knew that we were not going to be able to be restricted by the Torah and restricted by the Bible. We were going to have to go beyond that. And one way of doing that was going to have to be to undo the notion that the Torah had that kind of weight that made it impossible to do the new things that we had to do. And so to the extent that we're in a similar situation like that again today, we really do have antecedents, and we see them right here, surprisingly, in the Talmud's use of the book of Esther.
Absolutely. And I'll just add that the Flintstones nature of the book of Esther not only makes the reestablishment of a binding obligation obviously not so, that it is still open, but I think it superimposes on the kind of human the biblical story is painting, the ideal human. That story is painting us as a subservient, compliant, yes people, with who we are in the book of Esther, which is very independent, proactive, taking things into our own hands. God is famously not in the book of Esther. We're not waiting for God to tell us what to do. We're making stuff happen. So I think that's also part of the move of what the rabbis want to do with the book of Esther. It's saying this is the kind of person we want to be.
So the fact that the rabbis are using the book of Esther and using the misquotation from the book of Esther and not a misquotation from some other book to ultimately establish in this way that doesn't establish the binding nature of the Torah is no accident.
I think that's right.